everyone. Good afternoon. Um, we are going to get started in a little bit. I just have to pull up our slides, but in the description for the training, I believe it had descriptions of different trainers at our organization. So we're going to give a little bit of background about ourselves since that wasn't listed. So while I'm pulling this up, I will introduce myself. So my name is China Aquino. My pronouns are she, her, and I work at the coalition at our Detroit office as a program manager, and I support a lot of our housing efforts on a local level in Detroit, but also on a state level to bridge the gap between domestic violence service providers and homeless service providers as well. And actually, that is my background. So before I joined the survivorship and domestic and sexual violence movement, I worked in housing and homeless services. And I will let Brittany introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brittany Kellum. I work at the coalition as well. I work inside of the Detroit office, the Survivor Law Clinic, where I am a program manager and trauma specialist. So I get the wonderful opportunity to work with survivors of non-intimate partner sexual violence. And that means I'm doing some legal advocacy, court accompaniment, PPOs. It also means that I am doing the emotional or facilitating the emotional support for survivors of the clinic, be they around middle school age, so like 11 all the way up till very experienced adults. I've been in the field for about 17 years and worked in a variety of environments. So I'm excited to train. I'm not used to, my favorite is to train in person. So I'll be pulling on you all to give lots of feedback and ask questions as we move throughout. Feel free to ask questions throughout. You don't have to wait until the end, but I think that's all that I'll share in my introductions. You all look like you're having amazing summers. And I hope that we all keep having great summers. I was just looking at things in the chat.
Yeah, I loved hearing about where folks are from and what kind of fun things outside of work they've been doing with their family and their friends and outside enjoying nature. So we're going to get started. And again, please put any questions in the chat. We would like to address them as we're going through the training. Oh, give me 1 second here. And we want this to be interactive. Sorry about that. We had timings on. Okay. Okay, so today we're gonna give a little bit of a refresher of what domestic violence is as a whole, what are the dynamics. But if you've gone to one of our trainings before on what domestic violence looks like, we're also going to be layering in that additional aspect of how is this witnessed by children, how do children experience this, what is the impact, and how do we move forward? How do we support children and non-offending parents?
Yeah, and I'll just add quickly there, China, even our title slide, and we don't need to like necessarily switch back, but it says children living with domestic violence. And it's important to understand and talk about it as young people living with domestic violence because they're not purely witnessing. When domestic violence is happening in the home, they are victims. Young people are victims, children are victims. And there are a large amount of considerations and specific attention that needs to be given to what it looks like when children have parent, guardians, et cetera, the adults around them that are experiencing domestic violence. It's not that, this idea that a kid is on their iPad, they have their favorite pair of headphones, and they are unaware of their surroundings and unaffected by their surroundings.
Absolutely, Brittany. Thank you for clarifying that. Because that is a common misconception is that parents or family members or even society like to think that maybe they're not picking up on it. Maybe they're too young to notice, but we do know that it impacts them even from a young age. And so, again, what is domestic violence? Domestic violence is a pattern of power and control that one person exerts over another, carried out in several strategic ways. So there are a lot of myths about domestic violence. We will cover some of them, but what we want you to take away is that it is intentional, specific, strategic acts from a perpetrator to perpetuate control and power over their intimate partner and the household dynamic as a whole.
Yeah, and we know that it's a pattern and not a cycle. Everything that the perpetrator is doing is to victimize the partner, and in our case today is to have children also be the victims of violence. There is not this antiquated, we used to say it was a cycle, a honeymoon. We would describe it as a honeymoon phase when violence was not taking place. But we know that when perpetrators are being kind, when they are gifting victims, when they are being, a parent that is showing up and not hard to please. This is all a part of governing. This is all a part of maintaining power and control. And when I say governing, I mean governing this iron fist of violence in the household. So this definition, the reason why we have those three sections underlined again is to really hit home the point that it's going to be violence that is specific to the household, specific to the primary victim who's experiencing the violence. It is not going to be something, because perpetrators don't like to get caught, right? That is going to be something that everyone else around is very privy to, or it looks very obvious.
Okay, so when we say domestic violence, it includes a lot of different aspects, which we'll go into. So that includes physical abuse, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, economic or financial abuse, isolation, sexual abuse, and threats. And what is important here to note is that any or all of these could be co-occurring and the abuse contributes to perpetuating this power and control and isolation that makes it harder for the survivor to leave the situation in that dynamic.
Yeah, and again, reiterating, and we'll talk a little bit about it more in our next slide that also offers you all an opportunity to have some more buy-in in the training. But children are on the other side of those types of violence. They're on the other side of the physical abuse. They're on the other side of the threats, of the verbal abuse. And when I say on the other side, I mean they're present, and it has effects on them in school, especially from being an educator in any youth-centered environment, any environment where we've worked alongside children as advocates being in this space and in this training right now. We know we've been there when we've seen children that are deeply affected by something that is happening at home. It happens, it shows up it manifests in their behavior.
Yeah, so this slide has a lot of words on it, so it might be hard to read. So we want to go through some of the key aspects. So the power and control wheel is a model that was designed to explain how all of these different types of abuse and dynamics meant to exert power and control come together to create this dynamic where a survivor feels like they cannot leave. So it includes violence, physical or sexual violence, or both. And in addition to that, no matter how frequent or infrequent that is, it's the threat that that could happen at any time, on top of all of these other aspects of power and control, economic abuse, emotional abuse, isolating the survivor and creating this dynamic where there is constant intimidation and isolation and creating self-doubt, gaslighting, emotional abuse. All of these different tactics come together. And in addition to that, there's also minimizing, denying, blaming, um, obscuring uh, the motives of the perpetrator. And so they'll intentionally do that. They know that they're doing that. And they may even say that they're the victim in the situation. And another important aspect to this is that perpetrators may use children as leverage or as part of their power and control in a domestic violence situation.
Know about the power and control wheel that I'm sure we've all seen many, many times before. If not, this is what it looks like. Is that adult clients, and then if we could imagine with children that usually have not the same developed language or emotional vocabulary, they rarely come into an office or come into a space and say, you know, I think someone is using male privilege to victimize me. I think, you know, I noticed that my mom couldn't pay for a uniform. I think my mom is experiencing some economic abuse. People aren't saying these things that are in the bold headings here, but they're describing situations, they're describing environments that are going to be in the detailed sections below the headings. And it's up to us as advocates, it's up to those that are serving folks to be able to hear these things and have, number one, have foundational knowledge of this diagram and of the conversation of DV, but also being able to listen in terms of giving better resources that are fit for situations of DV. And the other piece about that is we typically talk about power and control being in the center. We describe spokes, all those good things. That's a great way to describe the diagram. But what I'll add that could be a little different is that when this wheel was developed, when this model was developed, it's that perpetrators describe, or I'm sorry, survivors talk about perpetrators having all of the power and control, that as a result of intimidation, emotional abuse, isolation, all of these behaviors that are in the wheel, the other person, the perpetrator, ends up with the power and control. And so that's how we get it at the center. That's what is able to drive the violence. And we'll talk about later how the power and control really does shift depending on what the perpetrator is trying to gain. And so we'll get at more of what we mean when we say strategic ways. But again, when we look at this, and we do have an activity where you all will be in breakout groups, or if we decide that this group is too large, we'll have you do some hybrid version of unmute and share in the chat. But we look at this and think about, how are kids being affected by these dynamics? So when there's emotional abuse, when one of the parents, for instance, let's say it's mom is constantly being put down, and mom is constantly made to feel bad about herself, and there's name calling. There are ways that children can walk away from experiencing, again, living with that type of daily emotional abuse that is going to be evident in their behavior. There could be echoing at school, right? When we think about children, we're going to think about their social environment most. That is their job that they go to. Most children are in some sort of educational environment. And so when I say echoing, maybe this child goes to school and calls their classmate the B word. Maybe maybe they're throwing out, calling their classmate or even calling the teacher or some adult support dirty. So it could, that's what I mean by echoing, like mimicking the types of words, especially when we think about younger children that they hear at home. It could also look like isolation, that the child does not know how to express, right, what they're feeling, the type of sadness that they could feel for the other parent. And so they isolate. They might put their head down. If they're older, they might opt out of doing work. They might leave class. That might be the type of child that walks out of class when introduced with a challenge, again, mimicking that nervous response that they feel at home, but getting to have the freedom of actually avoiding something that's uncomfortable. So China, I don't know if I feel like this would be a good time to lead them into the activity, but do we want, I don't know if you have something to say about that, but do we want to do the breakout rooms, or do you want to just have folks?
I think we have time for the breakout room. So let me stop sharing. So to our lovely folks at Micah that are assisting with technology, would you be able to um, create some breakout rooms?
Yeah, I can do that.
Perfect. And they can be randomized. And so when you're in the breakout rooms, what we want you to do is discuss the power and control wheel. So have you seen this before? Does this make sense? How might you see these examples coming up with adding that layer of children experiencing and witnessing domestic violence?
And how many are you looking to have per breakout group?
Let's see.
6 or 7?
I think 6 or 7 sounds good. We've got quite a few people.
Yeah.
All right.
Am I supposed to go to a breakout room?
I'm not.
It should be sending right now, and then usually a host or co-host will join if they would like to moderate or listen in and help conversation flow.
Yeah, it says that I'm going to room 8, so I'll pop in, but I'm gonna pop out because I don't want people to think that I'm eavesdropping on.
I clicked not now, so you might be able to skip it.
Oh, okay.
So I wonder if I put this power control wheel in the chat right now. I don't know if folks will be able to see it.
If we copy and paste behaviors, the DV behaviors or power and control, like physical abuse, verbal abuse, I don't know. They should be able to see that.
I can also broadcast messages out, so we
Okay.
can.
That would be great. So I sent a link to the image of the power and control wheel.
Okay.
If you could put that in the breakout rooms. Brittany, how much time do you think? 10 minutes?
I know some people are at work, so they can't do breakout rooms, so that's
Yeah.
totally fine. I understand that.
So maybe we started a minute ago, maybe 1:30. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Okay,
I can broadcast that to the groups as well.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you everyone for participating in our breakout room activity. I know it was not a lot of time, and it's okay wherever you're at. If this is the first time you're seeing this, or maybe you've seen it once or twice before. Would anyone be interested in sharing maybe what they discussed with the wheel or with DV and children, with the caveat that we do not want anyone sharing specific details of someone else's survivorship? Jessica, I see your hand raised.
Okay, so what we had discussed is with more of the children that are in this setting of domestic violence,
Mhm.
and how that can, be detrimental to them in a sense that they then take on a role that they should not have to take on, which is being like the patriarch of the family, like the one that takes care of everything, and then more of adult roles that should be mom and dad's role, but because mom and dad are back and forth, whether it be the mom be the harm door or the dad's the harm door, they're still having to be, they're in the middle and they're stuck in the middle. And I think that in a lot of cases that children that go through this and see DV in their home, they do not know how to differentiate adult worries and their worries, child worries. And that in return makes them mature and grow up a lot faster. And I think it also, limits them to relate to children their age because they're stuck in their own home, having to be the adult in the situation and having to make the choices. And they're scared to speak up if something's happening to them because they don't want to leave mom because they feel like they're the protector, or they don't want to leave dad because they feel like they're the protector.
Yeah, Jessica, I think, and whoever else, right? Whomever else, I think those are great things to have come out of for me. Like I've seen this power and control wheel 10,000 times, but I think those are great things to like literally to refresh this type of discussion. I think what you raise brings up a more general point about DV, children living with DV, and how the huge impact it can have on some children in parentifying them. And I also think that it could be used, your group's discussion could be used to draw out specifics of how children are used, which is a section of the wheel, right? And sometimes when we see using children, it's not always this overt thing that's done by parents or partners. It can be the byproduct, which is what I heard in your discussion of the DV. And it could also be used as a protective measure, a survival measure by a kid in the home. And children, children can figure out things very quickly. And they don't have to be, when we think about like what you're saying about children shielding other children from violence or shielding another parent, the non-offending parent for violence, or guardian, right? It's not just about the child that is 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, whomever. It could be a kid who's 5 years old. I think we underestimate a 5-year-old's capacity or a very young child's capacity to observe and understand when something is unsafe, and their capacity for empathy. Literally, when I say, or when we're talking about children living with DV, it's also experiencing DV. If a child has to shield a parent from violence, physically use their body to block or to throw their body over, over their parent just to try to avoid the other parent or the bad actor exacting violence, they will do so. They will do so. And that type of behavior, as you mentioned, and then of course I want to hear what other groups, we want to hear what everyone, whoever wants to share, but that runs out. That's the coping skill that they use to survive, but it turns into something that's maladaptive, that is unuseful as the child further develops.
China, we had
oh, go ahead. Thank you, Eric. Help.
China, we had a question from Joyce earlier. I apologize that I missed it, and she has her hand raised. Joyce, did you want to come off mute and ask that question, or that question, another question?
Well, I was going to add another question, but I thank you for reminding my other one. But I think the other person had their hand raised before me, so I don't want to be rude.
I believe
Was it
you were the most the earliest with your previous question, so
okay?
yeah.
Okay. So let me see. I got to remember my previous question. I got to find it here.
It's in the Q&A. I can read it for you.
Okay, thank
Um,
you.
so Joyce asks, is there a creative form of questions and or answers providers need to listen for to determine if this may or may not be a concern of abuse?
So this was surrounding the area when you were talking about the children, when they use the children, you were saying children may use language that's different versus saying um, dad has put us in an economic bind, right? Uh, what cues, what words, or how many times? What's that look like? Because we don't want to run off and go, oh, they said dad wouldn't give them lunch money. We don't want to assume off of something so simple. So, is there something, a guideline or anything like that that has been created?
So there's not a guideline that I know of that has been created, and I will guess why, right? Because sometimes whether we're dealing with clinicians, practitioners, folks that are in supportive spaces, when you start giving someone a recipe to involve CPS or a recipe to break confidentiality, then we're introducing another system and introducing another way that harm can be experienced. And so what trainings like ours and just across the board don't typically do, I will say good trainings, right? Is
Right,
to give someone a list of things to look for. What we teach is that you look for disclosure,
right.
and you look for developing a relationship with a child where it might start off as the helper, us as advocates, feeling that something is off.
Mm-hmm.
But relationship with the child and with continued expression, meaning if I'm talking to Jill, and forgive me if anyone's name is Jill in this space, there's so many people and I can't see all the names, but if I'm talking to Jill, who is again young kids, and I pick on young kids because not that older kids have problems with expression or are always super expressive, but sometimes there could be more of a gray area. But if I'm talking to Jill that's in kindergarten and Jill says, I just don't like being around, I don't like being around my mom. She makes me uncomfortable.
Okay.
Now that could just be a normal expression of Jill feeling uncomfortable around her child, around her mom. But if she starts to give other clues, well, every time mom comes around, um, I don't get to, they might not say I don't get to get the things that they need, but they might describe times or items that they go without when their
Okay.
mom is around. And they might start talking about that effect. Dad has to hide, or, my other parent has to hide things that he buys because mom won't let us spend any
Okay.
money. So
So
it
what we
might,
want to listen for is particular type of language. The reason I ask is because sometimes what common sense is not common to every person, right? Because we all have different culture and we understand things differently. Just like these children who grow up in this type of environment, their understanding and their delivery would be different because they're modeling what they see. Not all, but majority of the time, right? That's why I asked about that question because
Mhm.
even as clinicians or practitioners, I think sometimes we see things through a lens that is biased by our own lens. And so what do we do? And I ask that out loud, not because I'm concerned with it for myself, but because I see that happen so many times that people kind of stay inside a box. And it's like, you got to come out of this box and understand from a different level. You got to get to know this person. And the thing with this person may not equate to the thing with the other person, even though it may look similar. So that's
Yeah.
why I was asking that question.
That's an excellent question. I mean, I'll answer this quickly and then we'll probably have time for maybe one or two more during this like share out. But it's a concept called intersectionality. You take into consideration the whole person, but how their identities play out as it relates to violence. And when we're dealing with people, we have to be person-centered, which means that there is no cookie cutter analysis. And when we're talking about children, it's deeply developmental. Some of it is instinctual, and a lot of it is going to be the relationship that you have with the child. So it does require us to shed biases. And, another training, we give an example of corporal punishment. And some people have very strong value systems against corporal punishment, or we have teachers that might, or adults in the school that might think, someone has body odor, and we'll come to find out there's a cultural practice and it's not body odor. It's what our nose decides that the situation is. So you bring something up very relevant. So thank you for that, Joyce.
You're quite welcome. Thank you.
We had another hand raised, Delisha.
Yes, so I wanted to add to the using of children that not all the time children are used within the relationship. Sometimes they're used outside of the relationship. So once the relationship is ended between the parents, the child is used to spy on one parent, give reports, send messages. There's just so much that can happen with the use of the child inside of the inside the relationship and outside the relationship, even when it comes down to things as simple as child support. I've had many of my clients say like their partner refused to pay child support if they're not going to be together. So kids are used, but yet and still, even though they refuse to pay child support, they still have an expectation that they get to see their kids, and everything falls on the victim. Um, so yeah, kids are used even within the household where there's abuse, and even once the relationship is has ended, the kids still can be used.
Absolutely, Delisha. Thank you for that. Family law is quite often it enters the chat when we're talking about DV as it pertains to using children. I have had a client where one of the children was used to tape, on a phone conversations and video things. And when we think of that example, that's emotional abuse to a child. So you are exactly correct. Perpetrators will use children to further victimize the partner that they were already, victimizing, but also in that sometimes again we lose we lose the part where children are being victimized through that process. So the using of children is victimizing children. Thank you, Delisha.
And then our last question in chat here, Nichelle is asking, what are the next steps once a parent has left the abuser? For example, is it therapy, resources, are there safety measures? What's the recommendation?
So it is almost the statistic is astronomical. It's not 100 times more likely, but it's more than that for lethality to be an issue when a parent tries to leave an abuser. So I would say even before that point where the parent is deciding to leave the abuser, that a safety optioning plan is developed. So that would include therapy and resources and wherever that person feels comfortable connecting with. It's not to say that it can't be done after if the person chooses to negotiate and talk about safety after leaving the abuser. That is totally up to them. But we want to make sure the non-offending parent, if children are involved, have resources as well as the children, the child, who, however many are involved in the situation, they have resources as well. But those types of decisions, again, are driven by the non-offending parent. You really want to have buy-in from the survivor because they're in the front seat. It's their life. We don't have to live their life for them. They do. So coming up with a plan alongside them is going to ultimately be the best option. But of course, therapy sounds lovely if someone that's approachable for them. I'm not going to say that's a wrong idea. I just would say that it depends on the person and their ability to do so.
So for the clients that we service, it's all based off of what the client identifies. Some clients come into our shelter program and the first thing they want to do is talk about housing, stuff like that. First, some parents come into our program and they're concerned about what leaving the program look like if they haven't been in a position where they had to maintain housing, or they've been responsible for even things as simple as being the disciplinarian for the children. So sometimes coming out of that domestic violence relationship, it's like starting all over with certain learning how to draw boundaries and stuff like that. So some clients are coming out and they're like, I don't even know what's next. Like, can you guys show me what should I be doing? Like, I've encountered clients that didn't even realize that they need, once they get like housing support, they didn't even realize that they needed a security deposit, right? So they don't know how to make connections with like DTE and set up service because this is not an experience that they have because of the domestic violence. So it all depends on what is going on for that particular client. Um, Once people come out of the relationship, it can look so different per client, right? Some clients don't even want to talk about the abuse. All they want to do is just move on like it never existed. So again, it from my experience, and I've been doing this work for 20 years, it all depends on the client.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for sharing, and just to that last point that Delisha shared, it is something that we prioritize is survivor-centered services. So we prioritize the autonomy and dignity and respect of each survivor to make a decision
Mhm.
what to do when they're considering leaving a perpetrator, in the process of it, or after they've left. We need to respect their choices and their decisions. And I like the example that you gave because even though we have victim service providers throughout the state, survivors are interacting with so many other systems. So they might be going directly to the housing system first, their local COC. They might be seeking services directly related to their survivorship, or they might just be trying to meet their basic needs if they left their perpetrator. So thank you everyone for sharing. And we're going to go on to the next slide where we're going to keep talking about this.
So we talked about this inadvertently, but these are not an exhaustive list, obviously, but when we think about why a victim might not report, we know that society doesn't do a very good job of, in general, being good humans to survivors and being nice to people that come forward and supportive when they are wanting to disclose acts of violence. Thank you, Brian. We know that this type of trauma, DV, results in a lot of isolation. We know that despite instances of violence, partners sometimes just want it to go back to, when I say it, the relationship to go back to what they remember being more pleasant. And the perpetrator, the offending party, tells them that this is not going to last the whole, forever, right? So there's hope for change. And then there aren't a ton of resources for folks. We are a representative of a certain agencies and organization in this training, but often grants are limited. We try to refer and use good folks at agencies that we're made aware of, but we know that housing is limited. We know that like at the clinic, we only have a certain amount of attorneys. So we're all operating at very high levels as advocates, right? But then there aren't always a breadth of resources for the folks that we're serving. So, and survivors know this too, right? Victims of DV know this too. And there aren't a lot of there's not a lot of conversation all the time built around children that are experiencing domestic violence, right? Childhood DV. And then there's a lot of shame that goes along with societal denial and isolation. How do I talk about this thing that is taboo or I receive ridicule for? And then there's concern for batterers' welfare, especially in Black and Brown communities where there is quite a tumultuous relationship with law enforcement. So having to report could mean many things for them as survivors, but also their community, not wanting to be ostracized in their own community. I left fear, that the first three bullets, for last because these three definitely, I don't want to say affect children more, but parents most of the time don't want to report because they're protecting their children. They don't want anything to happen to their children. There's not a clear plan for safety that involves them and their children making it out alive. And intervention by the criminal court system, we know the court system is broken. And so just because someone calls law enforcement or makes a report, their children could be taken away. The non-offending parent could be charged with failure to protect. Exactly. Allison in the chat says, if I can't protect myself, how will they trust me to protect my kids? So these are real fears of the folks that we serve. And again, going back to Delicia's point, these are reasons why every other concern besides therapy is the first thing that a survivor talks about. It is housing. I need some money. I need a car. They're interested in mobilizing their lives so that they can have choices, so they can think about these other things that advocates tend to have as number one priorities. That's why a lot of folks stay in situations until they're able to think more clearly, even if it means to us that the person is still at a continued risk or more risk. And recognizing risk for lethality, this is something that's great for all of us as advocates to think about. When someone starts to, what I say is, come behind the bushes, perpetrators like the low-hanging fruit. They don't want to be caught, and oftentimes their behavior, like much of that power and control wheel, it's not illegal, the stuff that they're doing. It's not always illegal, but when they start harming pets, when they start forcing sexual intercourse or contact on their partner, when there's violent jealousy, when they're stalking, when they're leaving notes, when they're threatening kids, when a parent who is previously not directly involved children is now maybe forcing a child to sit and watch an assault or forcing a child to take part of the assault, using children literally to physically bring harm to the non-offending parent. These are questions of lethality. And this first piece that's on here, strangulation, frequently framed as choking. Choking is what we do on food when something goes down the wrong windpipe, it gets caught in our esophageal tract. That's choking. Strangulation is something that involves blocking when there's a loss of oxygen. And normally, again, this is one of these things that we might not hear our clients say that they were strangled. They could say that they lost conscious. I couldn't breathe at all, almost passed out, I fainted. They oftentimes don't say strangulation because it comes with some embarrassment and shame, because during strangulation, people can lose bladder control or bowel control. So this isn't an act that a lot of people are just very comfortable with sharing. So I bring this up not so that we can go out and tell non-offending folks, oh, I'm concerned, I think that this person is going to kill you. That's not good advocacy. but it helps us to start to work better alongside those we're serving when they're wanting different choices and asking us things. These are things that we can keep in mind, right? If a situation is rising to the level where someone might not make it out, right? Then we need to maybe, as we always say, we're in the survivors in the driver's seat. But I give the example of drivers training the old school when you had the trainer would have pedals, a way to control the car. That's when we start to maybe control the path a little bit. We become a little bit more hands-on when we're worried about safety. So lethality is important because I'm also a member of the Domestic Violence Fatality Review Team for Wayne County. And I cannot tell you how many cases we see where children are walking over the bodies of their parents, where they are, again, losing parents. And we know that if a person has the capacity to end someone's life of a non-offending parent, that they are highly likely to bring serious or detrimental harm to the child in the household as well.
I do want to add quickly, so as Brittany was saying, these are common patterns based on previous cases and research that have been shown to be linked to higher risk for lethality. But again, as Brittany shared, the survivor's in the driver's seat and they know their abuser more than anyone. And so these are guiding pieces of information that we can use to work with survivors in understanding risk and informing choices that they ultimately make. And again, as Brittany shared, this can look like abusers saying that they're going to commit suicide, threatening to hurt anyone that's linked to that jealousy or that stalking, threatening to hurt the kids, hurt the pet, hurt the survivor. We know that unemployment is a risk factor. So if the perpetrator becomes unemployed, there's more stress, more likely about finances, but also the perpetrator is home more often. Now, we did see that during the pandemic where folks were required to stay home and kids were home too from school. We saw that domestic violence rates increased noticeably.
And we also, I'll add really quickly to that, DV rates spiked, but also systems that were overwhelmed are places like Kids Talk. And if we're not familiar, Kids Talk takes forensic interviews for sexual violence, but also for other forms of child abuse. And so if there's a spike in that during the pandemic, children are at home, which means that their abusers are at home with them. Again, dispelling the myth that there's this stranger perpetrator. But though that happens, both children and adults are more likely to be abused by someone that they know. And in this case, we're talking about someone related to them or having a familial relationship.
Yeah. We also know that if the perpetrator has access to firearms, there is an increased likelihood for lethality. And as mentioned earlier, if stalking or monitoring behaviors are increasing, whether it's in person or monitoring a survivor's technology or their social media, that is another sign.
So on this slide, we talk stats, right? We talk prevalence. So we know in over half of battering incidents, children are present. And I'll add to that, 40 to 60% of children are also victims of violence when we're talking about domestic violence. So on top of over half being present and witnessing the violence. We're talking about cases where 40 to 60% of children are in fact harmed in households where DV occurs. We know that at least 3.3 million children aged 3 to 17 are exposed to intimate partner violence against their mothers. And some studies suggest it's higher, and we know this with statistics because it's just the folks that are reporting and reporting by whatever methods are available. And children are present and witness the murder of victims in 25% of femicides, which is this piece that I touched on earlier about children having loss of parents or a parent figure in the home on the fatality review team that I sit on. I see this a lot, obviously, because it wouldn't be a fatality review team if that weren't the case.
So the last statistic, we'll also mention that one as well because it is important. So children are present and witness the murder of victims in 25% of femicides. So murder of females. And again, as Brittany said, this is just the reported number. It is most likely much higher.
So the VAC model is important because it talks about perpetrator accountability at the root of it. And usually when we talk about vulnerability, that's the V, A is accessibility, and then C, credibility. Even in our language, in our work, right, we're so focused on survivors. And in the language, we talk about ways in which survivors are vulnerable or more accessible or credible. But if we're being even better, if we're growing in our professionalism and our thought leadership, then we know the way that we should be saying it is, what ways do perpetrators make survivors more vulnerable? What ways do perpetrators heighten their accessibility in order to victimize people? What ways do perpetrators increase or decrease their credibility in order to victimize? And so when we think about it like that, we are confirming this idea of power and control. We're doubling down that perpetration is a choice. And then we also are saying that perpetrators seek environments, opportunities, ways, strategic ways to continue to strip people of power and control in the home, but also in the home, our children, right? So in this example of the VAC model, perpetrators are choosing situations to make children more vulnerable, which means that they are less likely to interfere in violence, right? More vulnerable, so that they are also at the fighting end, meaning the losing end of a perpetrator's power and control, and then less likely not to disclose that violence is happening. This is why children are the perfect homes, right? A perpetrator is going to choose that because children aren't that credible. They make the children not credible, right? Either because of fear and threats and all the other perpetrator behaviors that we discussed, but taking advantage of a situation where a child is in the home and capitalizing, right, on that victimization because they are making an environment where children are not comfortable to share because they have threatened the parent, they have threatened the child, they have harmed a pet. So these are, again, this is how we see the behaviors play out even in this VAC model.
Absolutely. And also another layer to this is that children can't understand what is going on, the complexity of it. And so a part of them just wants to have a normal, happy, safe family with both parents involved. They may not,
Yeah,
they may recognize that a parent is dangerous and not safe, but they just want the dysfunction, the chaos, the abuse to go away. And so they don't know how to navigate that often.
absolutely. This is a picture of me when I was a kid. We had we had another picture in here, and I switched it out because the person is no longer a part of the coalition. So I said, why not? That's so funny. Photo of young child. I'm the young child. So you all can share out in the chat if you feel comfortable. How do children internalize their feelings? How do they internalize their feelings? Meaning not things that we might see, but what are ways that a child in a home of domestic violence, right? There's a perpetrator of domestic violence in the home. What does that look like internally for them? Self-esteem is reduced. Thank you, Christian. Yes,
Mhm.
that's a good one. Their internal dialogue. Yes, poor
yeah.
self-esteem. Yeah. Good, Allison. Anger.
Yes.
Depressive episodes. Absolutely. Sleeping more. Yes, Amanda.
Mm.
Yeah. Whoa. Now it's just coming in like more closed off, unable to use their voice to speak out. Yes, Jessica. Nichelle says, okay, see you, Nichelle. Repressing feelings. Thank you, Eric. Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Margaret, that's good because I usually only see the three, so I'm glad that you included fawn. Joy says physical aggression, physical ailments, yes, severe anxiety, reduced activity that previously brought joy, acceptance as this is normal. Yeah. Jessica and then China, you can keep reading. Jessica Wallace says acceptance is this being their normal because there could be some numbing that takes place, some dissociation. That's the land of dissociation. So even when we tend to talk about trauma, because that's what this is, we focus on like the negative. And DV for a child, childhood DV is that for sure. But it could, this self-talk piece that was also brought up by someone else, that internal narrative could be this idea of perfectionism that we think of being external, but it starts as cognitive, this need for perfection because of rules by the perpetrator and wanting to avoid harm. Very good. Stomach ache that may not be discussed. Yes. These are all great. I don't even know that I would have, I'm sure we could come up with like an exhaustive list, but masking, yes, that's exactly what I was talking about. When we're talking about children in a home with DV, we're talking about emotional abuse and trauma. We're talking about psychological abuse. Yes, we could also be talking about physical abuse, but I bring that up because whereas adult victims and survivors have some form of cognitive functioning, higher level thinking, children don't have that. Not until around 25 does that start, pumping with full force. So what we're talking about is introducing extreme violence or groomed violence, because it might start off gradual and kind of increase to this culminating event or the perpetrator's preferential style of power and control in the household. But this whole time we're talking about a development of complex trauma when we're talking about children. We're talking about them having a lot of internalized feelings. We're talking about them not having the critical thinking, not having the higher level processes. Children by definition are impulsive. Some are more controlled than others, but driven by their survival brain. They are very sensory oriented. And so when we're talking about a traumatic event like DV, there's a high likelihood that there could be a lot of brain harm, deterioration of the brain. It's not to say that neuroplasticity, this joining and making of new synapses cannot happen, but at younger ages, we're talking about high cognitive effects. There's high cognitive impact for internalization of feelings. Thanks, Christian. So how do children externalize their feelings? How do children externalize their feelings? What do they show? What can they show? Drug use, yep, especially when we're talking about older ages. I'm reading a question. What strategies are we implementing in society to teach children? China, can you read the responses? Or are you responding to Tara? I was gonna respond to someone in the chat.
Do you want to
Tara.
respond out loud or in the chat?
So what I've seen quickly, Tara, and I know that people are firing away with Tara or Tara. I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Keep talking about externalizations. I have seen young people start to have discussions of IPV, intimate partner violence, dating violence, for instance. The clinic had a partnership with King, and we were there for Title IX, so sexual harassment, that whole bit. But what we started to do is have preventative conversations about, what types of healthy talk, what types of conversations and speech and expression are expected at their age, and what do they know how to do. So I think when we start having conversations where children, one, are encouraged to express and give definitions of safety and trust and belonging, and actually giving them something to be a part of in the way of social engagement, but then talking about like titrating, not the whole power and control wheel at once, but they do make them for children, and talking to young people from middle school to high school age range, for example, about what emotional abuse looks like, what psychological abuse can feel like. There is almost a way to talk about almost all subjects with every age group. With the babies preschool or 3 to 5, we're talking about bodily autonomy. We're talking about learning safety in adults. Those types of conversations are useful because when people start having the emotional vocabulary to discuss things, they typically will. Even with our discussion of not reporting and that having a lot to do surrounding around like safety, if people have the words for something, that's a big start. They're all
Absolutely.
good. Go ahead, China. I'm sorry.
So I did add, there's a really great resource, loveisrespect.org, in the chat, that talks about teen dating violence and also what does a healthy relationship look like. And I see a lot of examples in the chat for how children might externalize their feelings. So aggression, sexually abnormal behaviors, fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, the way they dress, talk to others, respond to situations, journaling, writing out their thoughts or feelings. I feel like in some cases in young children, you see it in how they play with others and what pretend play they have. Yes. Especially with verbal abuse, if you catch on quick if a child is spoken to poorly at home and how they interact with their peers. Some children just refuse to talk, and especially really young children that are exposed before language is developed, unhealthy boundaries. Thank you, everyone.
Someone asked, what is fawn? Fawn is, so this is how I want to describe it. It is a partial nervous system response when you have exercised all the survival techniques that you have, right? You've tried to fight, you've tried reasoning. So fawn is when you make friends with the perpetrator. You acquiesce or go along with the violence. And you usually do not agree at all, but you start to side with the perpetrator. And sometimes we see this. I've had people ask in a training space, well, or say, you know, children will start to become perpetrators or aid in the perpetrator in you know, committing violence against a non-offending parent. And that could be an example of a fawn response. And it's almost as if the nervous system is exhausted. So in that way, it's similar to freeze. It's not a literal freeze, but it's a breakdown of the nervous system, and the person has run out of coping skills. The other one, flop, that is also mentioned. You all did not ask, but I will just say it so that you know the difference. Flop is a complete physical biological shutdown. That's when we have the reactions of when survivors or victims pass out completely, they black out, they faint, however you want to describe that, but they lose consciousness. That is what flop is, or come very like a catatonic state.
Mhm.
Good contributions though. So we've talked, not in huge detail, but we have talked a lot about the bad stuff that happens. So what does children's resiliency and healing look like? We know that despite externalizations and internalizations, right? Children don't respond uniformly to trauma. You know, we've all been at the playground and seen children run full force up the monkey bars. Not only do they go across the monkey bars, but they climb on top of the monkey bars, and then they slip and they fall and face plant. And there's a collective gasp among all the adults that are seeing this. And then the child giggles and runs away and has the time of their life at the playscape. And so while that is a more, you know, a sillier example, another child could be completely devastated. That would end their day. You'd have to scrape them up. They could have a whole physical injury. So we meet children where we are when we're doing this work, even when there is a disclosure, finding out as much information and not jumping to any conclusions or this kind of savior complex. Children, this piece about resiliency and healing, children have the capacity to be okay. And that's one of the things that you can definitely share with non-offending parents, or share within yourself if you need to hear that. It could sound like the most horrible or be the most horrific experience that you've ever seen when it comes to a young person. And this piece that I brought up earlier about neuroplasticity, the brain has the ability to build the connections. And you all can do some research on your own time, but the polyvagal theory is linked to a lot of understanding the good stuff when it pertains to trauma, and really walking people from being completely undone, even young people, right? To living a life of thriving and enjoyment and being reconnected with the things that they want to be. I'll also say this little piece, especially since this is near and dear to my heart, kids are, but somatics, having therapy that deals with therapeutic techniques that deal with the senses, sound, storytelling, storyboarding, writing. Some of the things that you all talked about as being externalizations can also be used in positive ways for paths to healing and resiliency.
Okay, so again, reiterating that every child's experience is different, and we may not know what they want to share at that time or what is their priority at the time. One of our member programs at our annual conference presented on children and healing from DV, and she shared that she was surprised that in the first activity with the kids, they just wanted to talk about, you know, who's dating who and who likes who. They were middle school kids, and she said she was really shocked by that, because based on what she knew about their situation, she didn't expect that. But here are some things that we know help children develop resiliency and help them have protective factors that can get them through a domestic violence situation and help them with healing after on. So enhancing the safety of the non-offending parent, that is where any systems that families are working with can support the non-offending parent with basic needs, but also any resources that they may need. Also, if children have the existence of a strong mentoring figure, someone that they can trust and go to, that is going to be protective for them and create resiliency. Again, any social support that they have or fellow kids or adults that they feel they can trust. And also, we know that participation in support and education groups is helpful. It is helpful for working through those feelings, as Brittany shared, the physical sensations, but also emotionally working through it. And then also modeling what is healthy behavior, what are healthy dynamics, and what does that look like?
Yeah, China, I'm wondering if we could jump ahead to the common characteristics of batterers and then from that one go to supporting the non-offending parent.
Yeah, let me find that slide.
We're just making some adjustments because of time, but also making sure that you all get what you need without cheating you.
So the common characteristics of batterers slide, you
Yeah,
said?
what are you doing that one and then jumping to supporting the non-offending parent?
That sounds good to me.
Okay.
So let me cue that up. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone, for your patience. Okay.
So we've talked about the power and control wheel. We've talked about some specific behaviors, but just so that we kind of wrap, excuse me, that portion of like how the violence happens and DV dynamics. We know that some characteristics of batterers are the following. So exhibits discrepancies between public and private behavior. This person is going to volunteer at the school, whatever it is. They could be the coach. This idea that they're going to be likable. They're going to want to win the praises and adoration of their community because again, though we talk about grooming being a part of sexual violence, grooming is also a part of DV. There is this period of time where the batterer is definitely doing what they have to do in a social way, right? In order to victimize their partner, whomever's living in the home, the children. And they use obfuscation to minimize or confuse. So obfuscation is like gaslighting, and downplaying an act of violence or an act of power and control so that the other party doesn't really believe that it was either that severe or maybe I'm making a big deal and that wasn't even an act of violence. And so this also further confuses children. It intensifies particularly feelings of internalization because in that second point, we understand how deeply psychological domestic violence is, even though we are using the term batterer and we think of society will paint a picture of there always being physical violence, but this minimization and confusion points to the emotional abuse piece. What's another one that I want? Feels a strong sense of ownership. I wanted to highlight that one because that is going to have a lot to do with how they parent, if they are the parent at home, that the children are theirs. if there's a biological relationship between the two parents and the children, that then their partner is theirs as well, and they get to decide what happens in the house. And this strong sense of ownership is deeply felt by the young people in the home. And it's also centered on this idea of rule making and enforcement. If I have a strong ownership of China as my partner and we have children, I am going to continue to make up rules that China has to do her best to follow, and the goalpost changes daily, but she's going to do so to minimize harm against the children. And I'm also going to assert more rules on China to make her look less credible, more vulnerable, so that I look like the powerful parent. I look like the parent that has more authority, whether it's perceived, and we know that it is, or it's actual.
Mhm.
So how do we support the non-offending parent? This is really important because when there are parents and children, of course, children is the theme of the day. We want to make sure that the parent gets support so that the child can get support. We want to kind of look at them as a system, even though they have individual needs. It's important that we really lean into the accountability of the perpetrator and not the survivor, that we are working hard to develop and ask the non-offending parent what they need to feel safe. That they're not depending on us to define safety for them, but that they are really crafting that definition and that reality for themselves. And then also the children take a part in this discussion. You're asking young people, it doesn't matter that they're toddlers. What does it look like for you to feel safe? And they might say they want their parent to feel safe, the non-offending parent to feel safe. But then even asking, okay, well, what does that look like? What does it look like? What to you, what things need to happen for your non-offending parent to be safe? And ultimately, they're going to start describing things that they want. So learning how to be curious and have those conversations are going to be key with non-offending parents, because again, ultimately it means that you're going to be building conversation with the young people. So a lot of common thoughts, or some common thoughts that non-offending parents have: of all the children in the world, why did this happen to my child, right? And the tough conversation is, why not your child in a situation where, especially if the non-offending parent is being victimized, the perpetrator was grooming everyone, grooming the situation so that violence could also take place to the child, and the perpetrator could victimize the child. Again, leaning into the stats that we know that over half of children in homes that are living with DV are also directly victimized. And how did I not realize this was happening? Well, because you were the primary victim. You were a victim in this situation as the non-offending parent. And so your survival skills are kicking in just as much as your child was trying to do the best that they could to survive. This also leans into this idea that parents feel like they have one job, and we can't take that one job away from them, which is feeling like that they have to protect their children, and they take that job very seriously. Non-offending parents do. And so when something happens to the child, when something happens to them and they're not able to protect or defend, it feels like a failure. Sometimes that's greater than the trauma that they'll be describing, especially as it relates to not only just the violence, but all this happens and now we're homeless, or I'm not able to financially provide. That's what's behind, how did I not realize this was happening? And I am a terrible parent. They think that they're a terrible parent. The last piece that I think is important for us as advocates is my child will never be the same again. This is when we use what we've learned in this space with the folks that we serve. They will be okay. You talk about the ability to to be resilient, to have healing, to have social engagement, to not strip them, young people, of the supports that they need, that how important socialization is, mentoring figures are, all of those things. That's where this goes. And that's where that goes in this part of the conversation. And so in that same vein, children need support from their caregivers. When we talk about affirming reactions, it's okay for parents to have emotion and display emotion, but parents probably need their own time to, in a healthy way, display those emotions so that the child is not further traumatized by seeing their parent in that type of distress. We want positive role models. In instances where the violence is sexual, of a sexual nature, children are going to need accurate information about their body or sex. And even if it's not child sexual abuse, a lot of perpetrators aren't going to want to be perpetrators in a family where the child is particularly vocal, where the child knows anatomically correct names for things. And we might squint our eyes and say, well, what value does that have? It's expression. You're more likely to tell on me if I am a perpetrator in your home, or you're more, whether it means that it's a non-offending parent or the perpetrator is abusing the child. And more importantly, they want to be listened to. They want to be told that their feelings are normal. They want to be told that they are going to be, supported through this process. I stray away from telling my young clients or parents this expression of, I'm going to keep you safe. Because that's not true, because we can't control perpetrators, and children aren't going to remember where you said that before. And that wasn't the case. So promising safety, particularly since safety is a internal concept, there are things that we can do externally to provide safety, but that is a feeling, that's an emotion that we learn over time if the world feels safe or unsafe. So being wary of that, but leaning into listening to and supporting feelings that are expressed. So my favorite ones from this slide is I believe you, or are, I believe you. And I would be happy to listen if you want to talk about this. I just kind of bashed, I will do my best to keep you safe. It's not one of my favorite ones. And telling someone about this was the right thing to do. That can feel like a lie to some children because their world can fall apart. A lot of survivors talk about when a disclosure happens, adult and young people, they feel like keeping the secret the time where people didn't know was better. It felt safer because they're having now to answer to systems, or people know their business. It's another violation. So I don't really tell the kiddos that telling someone about this was the right thing to do. It would kind of, from me personally, sound like, I'm glad you didn't keep this in. I'm glad you were able to express yourself. Those are things that I like better.
So we reached the end and we went a few minutes over. So thank you for your patience, but we had a wonderful conversation and engagement from everyone. We really appreciate the discussion. And on this slide, we have our contact information. And I am going to put the slides in the chat. So if you have a minute or two to stay around, we know that this was a very heavy topic to discuss. And so we want to do a very short version of an activity that we normally do. So normally in our 40-hour new service provider training, we will have folks, after learning about DV and children, go through the alphabet and list out something that children love that starts with each letter of the alphabet. So we don't have time for that, but so if you could think of the letters A, B, and C, any one of those, something that starts with A, B, or C that children love. if you want to put that in the chat or unmute. Cookies. Balloons. An alliteration, aspiring affirmations.
Yes, I like when I see those.
Right?
Books. I love balloons.
Apples.
Apples, bubbles, yes. Keep writing. I don't want to forget this. I hope the person is still on here. Someone asked about a lease if someone is experiencing DV, and the victim can break the lease. They just need some sort of proof, like a letter from an org. They might have to pay a portion of some of what VAWA, yes, yes, they do. They might have to pay a portion of some of their deposit or rent. But MichiganLegalHelp.org, I can write that in there, has a good article and assistance on that.
We also had one last question.
Okay, hopefully I can answer it, me or you.
So I put the slides in the chat. I know we put an activity in the chat, so I hope it doesn't get moved out of the way too much, but Sharda said, what are supports in place for individuals who experience emotional, verbal, and financial abuse, given that there is no visible proof of such and it's rarely prioritized? Are there any protective measures to prevent this type of abuse?
That's a hard one because you're right, it is hard to prove. If you send me an email, I can also put my email in there again. I can talk more about that, so I'm not stealing any more of you all's time. Yeah, I need a little time to think about that one.
Thank you, Brittany and China.
Of course, Kelly.
Thank you both so much for your time, for your expertise. Everyone who attended, we really appreciate you taking some time out of your Monday afternoon. I know it can be a busy day to come back into the work week. So we greatly appreciate that. As always, we want to encourage folks to consider being a member of MICA as an individual or organization. If you find this kind of content valuable, you will get a survey when your screen closes here. We really do rely on your feedback there as we make our decisions. And you can expect this training to be on YouTube in a few months if you are interested in the content again. But if folks have questions, they need to stick around. I believe we are able to do so if you need to get things out of the chat, things like that. Thank you all again.